Woman saves drowning white lion. What happens next is beyond belief. The muddy waters of the Usumacinta River churned violently as Dr. Isabella Cortez plunged into the raging current, her heart pounding against her ribcage. 30 feet ahead, a flash of white disappeared beneath the surface, a magnificent creature fighting for its life. In that split second, Isabella made a decision that defied all logic and self-preservation. Later, she would tell CNN that something primal took over, something beyond reason or scientific training. "It's drowning! I'm going in!" she shouted to her horrified research team on the riverbank. No one could have predicted that this moment would not only change the 32-year-old wildlife biologist's life forever, but would challenge everything modern science understood about the relationship between humans and apex predators. The expedition into the remote Lacandon jungle of southern Mexico had been planned for months. Dr. Cortez and her international team were documenting the effects of climate change on local ecosystems when they spotted something impossible: a white lion, completely out of place in this hemisphere, struggling against the flood-swollen river after apparently falling from a cliff during heavy rains. Isabella had spent her career studying big cats across 3 continents, but nothing had prepared her for this. The creature, later determined to be a juvenile male around 2 years old, was being pulled under by a whirlpool created by the recent flooding. Its ghostly white coat, with barely perceptible markings, appeared and disappeared in a pattern that was growing weaker by the second. Without hesitation, Isabella kicked off her boots and dove into the churning waters. A championship swimmer in her college days at UCLA, she cut through the current with powerful strokes. Her team members screamed for her to return, that she was committing suicide. Their voices faded as the roar of water filled her ears. "All I could see were his eyes," Isabella would later tell reporters, her voice breaking at the memory. "They were the most incredible ice blue color, and they locked onto mine with such awareness, such fear, but also something else I can't explain, like recognition. I knew in that moment I would either save him or die trying. What happened next defied all probability." Upon reaching the lion, Isabella braced herself for the animal to lash out in terror. Instead, the magnificent predator went completely still, as if somehow understanding this was its only chance at survival. With superhuman effort, the 5 or 6 biologist managed to grasp the scruff of the lion's neck, just as a mother lioness would carry her cub, and began swimming toward the shallower bank. The lion, later estimated to weigh approximately 265 pounds, seemed to enter a state of instinctive submission, allowing this human to drag him toward safety. When they finally reached the muddy shore, both collapsed on the wet sand, gasping for breath, their bodies trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. "I thought I would die from exhaustion, or that the lion would react and tear me apart once we reached land," Isabella confessed, "but he just lay there catching his breath beside me, watching us all as if assessing what had happened and who we were." Her colleagues, Dr. James Harper and Dr. Ludia Mendez, maintained a safe distance with tranquilizer guns ready in case the animal attacked. But the white lion simply rose slowly, shook his drenched coat, and instead of fleeing or charging, fixed his piercing blue gaze on Isabella. "It was the most profound moment of my life," she recounted, her voice hushed with emotion. "It felt like he was looking into my soul, acknowledging what had happened between us. Then he simply sat down, like a house cat, without showing any aggression whatsoever." Animal behavior specialists consulted afterward suggested the lion had likely entered a state of post-traumatic shock combined with extreme physical exhaustion, which could explain his unusual behavior, but no one could explain what happened in the days that followed. The team established a temporary camp while deciding how to handle this extraordinary situation. A white lion, the result of a rare genetic mutation causing leucism, a condition different from albinism, is extraordinarily unusual in the wild. Finding one in Mexico, thousands of miles from its native African habitat, was inexplicable. Initially, we assumed he must have escaped from an illegal exotic animal trade operation, explained Dr. Harper, the team's zoologist. But he showed no signs of having been in captivity. No collar marks, no declawing, none of the typical behaviors of captive-raised big cats. The mystery was partially solved when, after contacting authorities and wildlife reserves in the region, they discovered that a shipment of illegally trafficked exotic animals had capsized upriver several weeks earlier. The traffickers had fled, abandoning the animals. Most had perished, but apparently this young lion had survived, wandering through the jungle until his fateful encounter with the research expedition. What no expert could explain was the animal's subsequent behavior. While waiting for specialists from Profepa, Federal Attorney for Environmental Protection, to arrive, something extraordinary began to unfold. The lion, which they had named Lazarus for having essentially returned from death, began following Isabella around the camp. We initially established a safety perimeter, keeping him secured with a long rope, explained Dr. Mendez, the team's veterinarian, but he became so distressed whenever Isabella moved out of sight that we feared he would injure himself trying to reach her. Gradually, the team documented unprecedented behavior. Lazarus followed Isabella like an imprinted cub, sleeping near her tent, walking alongside her during daily tasks, and even attempting to help when she collected plant samples, as if imitating her movements. "It's as if he's established an imprinting bond with her," explained Professor Miguel Ramirez, an ethologist from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, who was called to evaluate the case. But this typically occurs with newborn animals, not juvenile specimens. Additionally, imprinting usually happens with the first creature they see after birth, not with someone who rescues them years later. The scientific community became fascinated by the case. Researchers from around the world traveled to the remote jungle camp in Chiapas to observe the extraordinary bond between the biologist and the white lion. "There are documented cases of animal gratitude," explained Dr. Sarah Williams, a zoologist from Oxford University who traveled specifically to study the case. Elephants remembering their rescuers decades later, dolphins protecting swimmers. But I've never seen anything remotely similar with big cats. These are solitary predators by nature, hardwired to view humans as either threats or prey. While scientists debated theories, the relationship between Isabella and Lazarus deepened. The lion began responding to basic commands, not through training, but from an apparent desire to please his savior. Isabella could examine his paws, check his teeth, and even draw blood samples without the animal protesting. "It's as if he's made a conscious decision to trust me completely," Isabella told a National Geographic documentary team that arrived to film the phenomenon. "Sometimes he looks at me in a way that seems almost human, as if he understands everything I'm saying and feeling." Blood analysis revealed another surprise. Lazarus wasn't just a white lion. He possessed a genetic mutation never before documented, affecting not only melanin production, causing his leucism, but also brain regions associated with social behavior and species recognition. It's possible this mutation has altered his intraspecific recognition, theorized Dr. Elena Ramirez, a geneticist from Stanford University. In simple terms, he may not fully identify as a lion, which could explain his unprecedented capacity to bond with humans, particularly with the person who saved his life during a traumatic event. The story of the white lion, rescued by an American-Mexican biologist, soon went viral. National and international media covered the extraordinary relationship, and social media exploded with images and videos of the majestic white animal following Isabella around camp, carrying her equipment by holding straps in his mouth or simply lying beside her while she worked on her laptop. Mexican authorities faced a dilemma. On one hand, lions are not native to Mexico, and Lazarus would normally be transferred to a specialized sanctuary. On the other hand, separating him from Isabella could cause severe trauma to the animal, potentially fatal given his unusual attachment. After weeks of deliberation and considering the unique scientific value of the case, Semarnat, Mexico's Secretariat of Environment and Natural Resources, made an unprecedented decision. They authorized the creation of a special research center in the Montes Azules Biosphere Reserve, where Isabella could continue her work as a researcher while studying Lazarus's behavior and their extraordinary bond. "I never imagined my life would take this turn," Isabella reflected 6 months after the rescue, sitting on the porch of the biological station with the imposing white lion resting at her feet. "Everything has changed. But I don't regret for a second jumping into that river that day." The center, partially funded by universities interested in the case and by donations from a public moved by the story, has become an important hub for research on animal behavior, big cat genetics, and species conservation. Scientists from around the world come to observe how Lazarus, now almost 3 years old and weighing nearly 400 pounds, continues to behave more like a loyal companion than a predator. The lion voluntarily participates in cognition studies, allowing brain scans and periodic blood samples that have provided revolutionary data on feline neurology. The most astonishing thing is how he seems to understand abstract concepts, explained Dr. Carlos Jimenez, a neuroscientist working on the project. He can follow complex instructions, recognizes patterns in tests we would normally only perform with primates, and shows an empathy toward Isabella that defies everything we knew about big cats. Perhaps the most extraordinary moment occurred when Isabella suffered a severe fever from a tropical infection. Witnesses described how Lazarus refused to leave her side, lying next to her for 3 days, growling at anyone who tried to approach except the doctor, whom he seemed to recognize as someone who was helping. He even tried to bring her water, recalled Dr. Mendez, now the veterinary director of the center. He would push a bowl with his nose to her bedside. "I've never seen anything like it in a wild animal, especially a predator." The story of Isabella and Lazarus has inspired a new generation of biologists in Mexico and changed public perception about big cat conservation. The center's educational program receives students from around the world, showing how one act of selfless courage created a bond that science still struggles to fully understand. "I don't believe it's a miracle," Isabella reflected in her research journal, which later became an international bestseller. "I think it's a reminder that our connection with other species runs deeper and is more mysterious than our textbooks have taught us. Sometimes, when you save a life without thought for your own, you create a bond that transcends species." Today, Lazarus and Isabella continue to defy expectations. The white lion, now an unwitting ambassador for conservation, has helped change animal protection laws in Mexico and combat the illegal trafficking of exotic species. And while scientists continue to study their extraordinary relationship, Dr. Isabella Cortez remembers each day that sometimes diving into a dangerous river to save a predator can be the beginning of a story that no one would believe if it weren't so perfectly documented. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be sharing my life with a white lion who follows me like a puppy, and that together we'd be changing the science of animal behavior, I would have said they were insane. She smiles as she strokes Lazarus's magnificent white mane, but sometimes reality truly is more extraordinary than fiction.